Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? As you're no doubt aware, the prices of retro games and hardware have gone up steadily over the years. So a lot of people are turning to emulation, but is there really much of a difference? Video game emulation has become very common in the past few years, and we've even seen it adopted officially by the big name developers. Sometimes by the very game manufacturers, they're emulating their own systems from the past. The obvious example is going to be the Virtual Console series that Nintendo offers on the eShop. It's obvious that those are simply emulated games. They didn't rewrite those games for the newer platforms that they run on. And the fact that they even call the series the Virtual Console kind of, leads some credence to that. But even with other platforms, we've seen emulation in play. For example, Sony started releasing PlayStation 2 games on the PS4. And it became obvious after a little while that they're actually doing it in emulation. They're not rewriting the games. We've seen this with other consoles too, the Xbox 360 playing original Xbox games, that sort of thing. But emulators have been around for quite a while. I remember even as a kid, there being emulators for some of the more basic systems like the NES and the Super NES, the Genesis, that sort of thing. But we seem to have it be even more prevalent. And from a marketing perspective, it's pretty smart because you're increasing the audience from these old games. You're making more money off of them again on newer platforms that people are more interested in picking up in terms of the hardware. I don't think there are that many people who would want to buy a brand new version of an original NES, though we'll talk about that in a moment. But, if you've already got something like a PS4 or an Xbox One, there's this back catalog of games that are still quite a bit of fun. And if they can figure out a way to make them available as emulation titles, then, they can make some extra money off of that. But the experience between playing a game in emulation and playing it on real hardware can often be very different. And there's logistics to it as well, and economics, and even some ethics, to go along with it. The first thing that you'll notice is the gaming experience really is pretty different. Even with brand new modern consoles that have lots of power, sometimes you'll notice that emulated games actually don't play all that well. Sometimes even on PCs, PC emulators, ones that have been fully mature, they may not play as well. And a lot of that comes down to the way emulators work. The first thing you have to understand is that emulators are trying to, in software, do what the original systems did in hardware. Now, in this day and age, that seems pretty straightforward, right? I mean, we live in this age of virtualization where you've got the cloud computing and just tons and tons of servers and computing systems and all that out there, all running together on a smaller pool of hardware, that sort of thing. But emulation is very different from virtualization. With virtualization, it's where you've got software running on the same hardware as other software. But that software is designed to work on that particular platform. Whereas emulation is when you've got software that's not designed to work on that platform, and you've got this layer in between, the emulation layer, trying to do all that translation. Where emulation has always struggled a bit is in that layer. And a lot of it is because of the custom nature of the hardware. Here's an example. The original Game Boy was based on a Zilog Z80 processor, which is actually a pretty standard processor. It's been around for a long time. It's well documented. A lot of people know how it works. So you would think, that'd be pretty easy to write an emulator for. Well, here's the catch. Nintendo customized it. They removed some features from it that weren't necessary for a handheld game platform, and they added some features to it that are helpful. And of course, Nintendo's going to want to keep that kind of close to its vest. It put a lot of R&D development time into that. So you can't exactly call up Nintendo and be like, hey, can you send me the spec sheet and diagram for the custom processor that you put in the Game Boy? I'm running an emulator for it. They're going to hang up on you. So the problem is the developers of emulators, whether they're open source, just volunteer developers, or whether they're commercial developers, they oftentimes have to reverse engineer how all this custom hardware works. That takes time, and that's a challenge because sometimes reverse engineering isn't as straightforward as you would think. Yeah, from a logical perspective, it's like you can see the game, you can play the game, you can see when I press this button at this point, the character does this, that sort of thing. You know, why can't you just write an emulator to do that? There's a lot more going on under the hood, though, and that's where it gets really difficult. In fact, there are some games for well-known emulators that just don't work very well. There, I believe, is at least one game for the not the Super NES, the Sega Genesis, that just doesn't really work well in emulation. And that's because the game took advantage of parts of the Genesis hardware that Sega didn't even intend for people to take advantage of. They kind of found like a back door or a super cool way of executing things that makes the gameplay better, the original developer. But Sega never really intended anybody to use. And that kind of stuff is what trips up emulation developers. And so you end up really struggling trying to get this stuff to work. The Sega Saturn is a notoriously difficult platform for emulation. There are emulators, and don't think I'm trying to talk trash about the developers of emulators, because I know they're working very hard. But that's a very complicated system, and they haven't really gotten emulation to work all that well for it yet. Just because of how complex under the hood that hardware is, how custom it is. You can't really dig into it that easily, especially if you're just a volunteer developer. Without tons of experience, tons of equipment, that sort of thing, to try and physically disassemble these systems and just understand what they're doing. So that's kind of the experience side of it. Emulation, just from a technical perspective, may not work all that well. The other thing is kind of the experience of it from an emotional or psychological angle. Oftentimes when you're working, playing a game that's been emulated, you're not playing on anything close to original hardware. You're playing on a modern display, so it's going to be an LCD screen that probably won't render the effects of the game, the sprites, the graphics, all that great. It'll tend to look a little mushy. The other thing is you're probably not playing with an original controller. You're probably playing just on the keyboard of your computer or with whatever controller came with your modern console. And that kind of ruins the experience a little bit. There's this satisfaction that some people get from having the original hardware, having the original controller, dropping the cartridge in there, pressing the power button, and playing it as it was originally intended. There's also kind of an additional challenge to playing it on original hardware in that a lot of the really old games didn't support saves, either partially or at all. So you have a little bit more pressure to play well, because you know that if you get 3/4 of the way through the game and end up with a game over, you don't really have a save state to go back to like you do if you're, oftentimes if you're playing in an emulator. So it changes the whole mindset. Now, I'm not going to say and get on the bandwagon of you should only ever play games on original hardware, screw emulators. I know that there are plenty of people who love emulators, and as well, sometimes that's just the way I want to play it. I don't necessarily want to drag all that original hardware out from the storage bins in the closet and hook it up just to, get 5 minutes in on a game. Sometimes it's easier just to fire it up, as a virtual console title or whatever. So I think a lot of it's just really very personal in nature in terms of which way you want to go. But the other thing that you do also have to think about are kind of the ethics, the morals of it. And there's a lot of gray area in this. If you're playing an original game on original hardware, you own it, right? You bought that game, you bought that hardware, either brand new back when it came out or used at some point in the near future, the recent future. But you own it. You own that copy of it. You're legit. a lot of emulation involves just downloading the ROM of the game, unless you go and buy it from, within a legit kind of source like the eShop, like the PlayStation Store. But at least where emulation started was, I don't want to call it I don't want to call it like it started as, the intent of piracy or whatever, because I'm sure the intention was good, just to be able to have access to more of these games and share them and play them, especially ones that aren't really all that easily accessible or available to people. But I don't think there's going to be any argument in saying that emulation really started out by sharing ROMs. And if you download a ROM for a game you don't own, in most countries, you're pretty much violating copyright. I'm just going to say pretty much violating copyright. There have been some changes over time as to if it's considered abandonware, you can shift it to different platforms, some kind of caveats like that. But for the most part, it really centered around downloading ROMs illegally, for lack of a better term. Obviously, that's gotten better with official sources, but whether you see there being a problem with downloading ROMs for games you don't own or not, that becomes a bit of a gray area. I do appreciate the fact that emulators where you're downloading ROMs can help spread awareness for games. There are some games out there that are just incredibly rare. They go for ridiculous amounts of money. And unless you are deep-pocketed enough to be able to pick up a copy of that game, you're probably never going to play it. So I do understand and appreciate the fact that it helps spread awareness to these games. People can have access to them that otherwise wouldn't have access to them. One would wonder why some of these games haven't been officially licensed and re-released, but for whatever reason, the original publisher either can't get the rights or whoever would want to re-release it can't get the rights. So there does exist this grouping of titles that probably will never see the light of day as an official release ever again. And so in cases like that, I don't really have a problem, with people downloading the ROM. Some people say, even if it is a new title, or even if it's an original title that's been released recently, as an official thing, you buy it off the eShop for $2 or whatever. Some people say they have no problem downloading a ROM off the internet for that. That's where it starts to swing a little bit more towards that's not right. I do understand their argument. Oftentimes they'll say, well, the publisher's already made its money on it, right? And it's true that the publishers don't make any money on the sale of used games. If you buy a used game from a video game store, Nintendo or Sega or Konami or whoever, they're not going to see any more money off of that. They only made their money when that game was sold brand new. But to say that it's okay to download a ROM even though it's available for sale officially as, an emulated title, that's kind of taking a little bit too far for me, unless it's ridiculously overpriced and it's just an obvious cash grab by that publisher. I think a lot of publishers have been doing the pricing thing right for the most part. I think the economics of that have really kind of worked out. eShop titles, virtual console eShop titles are pretty cheap, just a couple of bucks. Even some of the original like PlayStation 1 titles off the PlayStation Store are pretty cheap. Just a few bucks. I don't think I've seen anything that's been more than like $15 for some of the bigger games. And oftentimes they go on sale as well. A few months ago, I remember they did a sale, and even though I own physical copies of it, I went and bought copies of like Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9. And that whole transaction cost me, I'd like to say it was like $20. Yeah, I already own copies of 7, 8, and 9. Yeah, I could just, rip images of the discs or download them online and play them on an emulator, but there's the convenience factor of, well, I've already got my PlayStation 3 hooked up to the big TV in the living room. it saves me the trouble of having to dig out an original PS1 and deal with all the wires and, wait loading times for the discs and that sort of thing. Yeah, the graphics may not look quite as good on the new one, believe it or not. Sometimes graphics don't look as good emulated as they do on the original hardware. But there is that convenience angle. The bummer about the original hardware is getting it to work well with modern TVs and stuff like that. There are some people that drop pretty substantial amounts of money to be able to get older game systems to look good on modern TVs. Between doing stuff like RGB mods to the console itself, and then video upscaling devices like the FrameMeister, which I looked at one of those. Those are like $350 just for a FrameMeister. I mean, I'm sure it's amazing, and I've heard really good reviews and everything of it, but that's a chunk of change, There have been some strides in making built-in modules. There's one, the name is escaping me right now. I'm sure you're all going to start shouting down in the comments as to what it is, but there is a company that makes a module you can install inside the N64 to give you native HDMI output. I'd like to say that thing runs about $100-ish bucks, which is a little better, but that's still some money. I mean, you got to really love the N64 to be able to drop that kind of change. So there are some benefits to emulation in that perspective, in that it's a lot cheaper to do on a modern display. But, again, unless it's got advanced controls for video filtering and is designed to look good on a modern display in terms of upscaling and all that, then, it's usually going to look kind of mushy, and you would probably get better results from a technical perspective using the original hardware and spending all that money. The catch to all of this is, and I've talked about this before in a previous episode, you may want to go watch that one if you haven't already, is this NES Classic Mini. It sounds like Nintendo is going to cater a little bit to, I don't want to call them the purists, because the purists are going to just shake their heads at this thing, but it sounds like they're going to cater a bit to those who are serious about playing the original games, because there are going to be video filters built into it. It sounds like they'll even offer artificial scan lines, that sort of thing. And that may be enough to spur other companies into starting to take some of this seriously, whether they implement that into hardware or software. For Nintendo to be able to push some kind of update, and maybe they'll do this with NX, we don't know yet. But for Nintendo to start to take these virtual console titles a bit more seriously and offer kind of these tips of the hat to those who are a bit more serious about how their games look and sound, I think would be really cool. To be able to build those features into the virtual console just natively, so it plays with all the games that you can buy through the eShop. And then maybe others will follow suit. I mean, like I said, with Final Fantasy VII, it's nice that it doesn't take as long to load. You don't have to sit there and wait for the CD, but it's pretty soft. They could sharpen it up. They could give you the option for scan lines. They could give you options for different scaling methodologies, different color palettes, that sort of thing. And so I think there's a lot of places that emulation can go, which is really interesting when you think about it. One would think, well, emulation you're emulating it, right? You're done. There's a lot more to it. And I think there's a lot bigger future to it, especially as this back catalog of games continues to increase. We'll see where things go in the coming years when it comes to emulating like PlayStation 2 games, PlayStation 3 games, Xbox 360 games. Are future versions of consoles going to handle those games well? How are they going to handle those games? What's the look going to be like? Are they going to look as good as they originally did? Are they going to try and make them look better? That sort of thing. But in any event, I'm curious, of course, as to your thoughts. So shout out down in the comments. What do you think about emulation in general? Are you a big fan of it? Do you prefer original hardware? Do you see there being much of a future for it? Where do you think that's going to go? Are we going to see companies embracing it more and offering more of these kind of back catalog titles? Or is it going to kind of stay at the levels that it is? Also, remember that I'm always accepting suggestions for future videos, so shout out down in the comments for those as well. Again, I may not get to it right away, but they all go on a list, and I check them out every week when I decide what I want to talk about. If you like the video, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.